Hi, guys. Hi, Matt. Hi, Ashley. I guess I muted myself instead of turning myself on. Well, I apologize for the inconvenience. Let's pretend we're not 2 minutes in and start over. Hi, guys. Welcome to the live stream where I should do things right ahead of the time. I apologize, Ashley, for deceiving you. I assure you that was not my intention. For those of you who have stuck with the video, thank you for coming. Let's talk about this week's founders. For those of you who are new here and actually are still watching, we're about to talk about the last 7 articles published on my website, Founder of the Day. Yeah, Matt, I assure you, I assume some sound is better than no sound at all. But let's get into it. So, we're going to talk about Arthur Fenner to start off. Arthur Fenner has a really fascinating story with Alexander Hamilton. But a little background on him. Fenner came from a wealthy family. They owned Fenner Wharf in Rhode Island, which was just off of that. Fenner Wharf is where the Gaspee affair happened, which was an event, for those of you who don't know, fairly famous, but it was a British ship was essentially attacked and burned by patriots in the years before the revolution actually broke out. So, that gives you a little place in his rank in society. Arthur was going to college throughout part of the war, but he did serve in the Revolutionary War and achieve the rank of captain. After this, he becomes involved in politics, as wealthy people are wont to do. And famously, Rhode Island did not send anyone to the Constitutional Convention. It took them like a year and a half to ratify the Constitution after George Washington was already president. And when they did, it was a very heavily anti-federalist area. And when it did finally get ratified, there was a strong disagreement between who should take over as the next governor, between people who supported the new government, which most Rhode Islanders who supported the new government did so tenuously. How do I say? They did, but they didn't want to. They were just like, there's every other state is in this union except little Rhode Island. We probably should give up. And people who really did not like the Constitution. So they came up with a compromise candidate whose name was Arthur Fenner. So Arthur Fenner serves as governor of Rhode Island for about 15 years, which is a really long time. I believe he's the longest serving governor, I don't want to say in American history, but definitely in Rhode Island history from what I read. And during this time, he does a lot of things. He covers internal improvements, builds a bunch of roads and bridges, really becomes popular in Rhode Island. Like I said, he keeps getting elected back for 15 years. Furthermore, during this time, Fenner, there's a fire in Rhode Island that covers, I believe it was Portsmouth, not Portsmouth, that's New Hampshire. The capital of Rhode Island, whose name eludes me and I feel silly, had an important fire that burned a good portion of the city that he helped the city recover from. Fenner, now the most interesting thing I read about Fenner, however, is he had been an elector for President of the United States, but during the election of 1800, he was not. He was governor of Rhode Island, but he was not a presidential elector. But who comes through? Alexander Hamilton and his group of, not henchmen necessarily, but hench people. Alexander Hamilton comes through Rhode Island with a few of his cohorts, and they are talking about the presidential election. Now, Hamilton mistakenly thought that Fenner was a presidential elector at this point. Fenner didn't outright say he wasn't. He wanted to hear what Hamilton had to say. Now, again, Rhode Island was a very anti-federalist place, but at this point, 10 years in, people had... Yes, Providence, thank you, Matt. At this point, 10 years into the Constitution, many people in Rhode Island had started supporting Federalists because since they had the Constitution, that should be the best way to go. Sponsoring trade and everything. So here comes Hamilton, and he has a meeting with Fenner, and Fenner has a few friends there too. And Hamilton essentially starts alluding to winning the election against Thomas Jefferson. Now, things were not looking great for John Adams, but John Adams was the Federalist president, and here Hamilton is, as for all intents and purposes, the leader of the Federalist Party, but the sitting president was really the leader of the Federalist Party, and Hamilton's coming through, meeting with people he suspects are Federalists, trying to get them to vote for the vice presidential candidate, Thomas Pinckney. Now again, this was before, this was still the time where whoever got the second amount of votes became vice president and first became president. Again, the election of 1800 would end with Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied. And Jefferson would end up president, and Burr vice president, and neither of Hamilton's candidates would win in the end. But it's extremely interesting to know that you have Alexander Hamilton going around behind the back of his president, trying to get the person running for vice president. Thomas Pinckney was a very popular American from the South. So Hamilton thought, if we could have everyone vote for Pinckney instead of Adams, then not only could we get the Federalists to support Pinckney, who just returned from being minister to Great Britain, but we could peel off certain Jefferson voters from the South who wanted someone from the South, but weren't really tied to Federalist or Democratic Republican, but really just wanted someone from the South, which was something that happened back then. And therefore, Hamilton came up with this scheme. And what's really interesting is he ends up talking to Fenner, who defends Adams. At this point, he was more of a Democratic Republican, but he had come to like John Adams. Adams just a few years before had come through Providence, thank you, Matt, and said hi to the governor. And the idea that, hey, why don't we replace the sitting president with someone of his own party? And again, this is the second president. This isn't like nowadays, or even like Teddy Roosevelt doing it to William Howard Taft. This is election number 4, technically. So this kind of scheming does not look good for the early republic. When Fenner presses Hamilton on the subject, he says something along the lines of, why would I throw John Adams out of the cart now when he's already why cut the horse from the cart? Something along those lines. Something more clever. And Hamilton says it's better to lose the man than the measure, which I think is a very strong indication of how Alexander Hamilton did view politics. He does think it's more important to get done what you need to do, and you can, ask questions, apologize later, or sweep up the body, bury the bodies later is a better way to put it. Because when Hamilton leaves, he kind of explicitly says to Fenner that he's gonna go to man, can't get the words out today. Can't get it out. I can't get my mic right. I can't get the words out. I apologize. Hamilton basically alludes that he's going up to Boston so he can talk to other Federalists about this same scheme. And what's interesting is the scheme only seems to die out because someone who was in the room at the time, and I don't think it was Fenner, I'll explain why in a second, but seems like one of Fenner's friends in the room actually sent a letter telling this whole story to the Albany Journal, I think was the paper, one of the newspapers in Albany at the time, sends it to Albany, and they publish the story. Now, they don't use Hamilton's name, but they allude to who he is, and everyone gets it. And then this whole Charles Cotesworth Pinckney thing, becoming president, kind of dies out immediately. He's back to being Adams' vice presidential ticket in the eyes of the people in general. And I'm researching the life of Arthur Fenner, and I stumble onto this story, which is amazing. Now, I do believe I put a link in the article itself. If you're interested in all the articles I'm talking about are in the links below. I do believe I put a link in there where it actually publishes. It's Arthur Fenner's. First of all, this gets published, and Arthur Fenner then feels the need to write to a friend and outline exactly what happened. And it's not exactly as it's published, but it's really close. Close enough where someone had to be in that room, and I doubt it was one of Hamilton's guys. But because Fenner justified it and used slightly different words, then it seems like he was not the one who actually wrote to the paper. And for some reason, I've spent a long time studying this. I had never heard of Alexander Hamilton trying to get Charles Cotesworth Pinckney to be the guy for the Federalists in place of sitting President Adams. Let me know if you guys have ever heard of that. I've never heard of anything like that until last week when I stumbled onto this paper, which is the best part about writing Founder of the Day, is I keep finding fun new stuff like this. But we are going to move on now to Friday. As always, I publish an anti-Federalist. Used to be a Federalist paper every week. Now we're doing anti-Federalist Fridays. And this week I wrote about a guy named Joseph Taylor. Now, I researched way too long to find out information about Joseph Taylor. In fact, I was researching this story for last week's anti-Federalist paper, and I could not find anything on his life. Now, at this point, what I do know is, actually, you think there's a line alluding to it in Hamilton. Interesting. So I do, real quick, I will note on that, Hamilton did actually publish publicly his dismay with the Adams administration. I do believe that was mostly focused on, he wasn't happy that Adams was firing all of John, when Hamilton left, he left Washington, a cabinet full of, like, I don't like to call him henchmen. Like, Timothy Pickering was a serious, American revolutionary and a really important one, as was James McHenry. Two really important members of the American Revolutionary War, cabinet members for the George Washington. But once George Washington leaves, you have Adams come in, try and do his best to be a George Washington and be objective and accept Washington's cabinet to keep things running smoothly. And then he's listening to his cabinet, because that's why you have a cabinet, to advise you. And then he finally realizes, oh, this cabinet is just advising me as to what Hamilton wants and not what they actually think. Or maybe they do think this, but still. So, I'm curious as to what line you're referencing, Ashley, because the ones that strike me immediately in mind are about those two things: the article he published against John Adams and his frustration with the firing of Pickering and McHenry. But anyway, let's continue. So Joseph Taylor I know very little about. What I do know about him is it seems like he was from North Carolina, and he did serve in the war for at least some period of time. And then he seems to have spent some time in the North Carolina Senate for several years until the Hillsborough Convention. Now, the Hillsborough Convention was the first time North Carolina met to discuss ratification of the United States Constitution. And out of this convention, they don't ratify the Constitution. And one of the leading speakers at this Constitution was this obscure dude named Joseph Taylor, who, again, there's very little information about that I could find about his early life and his later life. Now, I'm sure if I went to North Carolina and researched the papers of the Hillsborough Convention, which I could not find access to on the internet, nor could I get to North Carolina, I could find more about this gentleman. Well, actually, I could find most of the Hillsborough Convention, the notes from that. So I do want to correct myself there. And that's where this comes from. So, unlike many of the Anti-Federalists, there are a handful I've discussed who, of course, they were not written down like most Anti-Federalist papers. Many were speeches given at the ratification conventions, and then after which were taken as notes and published later. And Joseph Taylor's discussion was published as From North Carolina. How convenient. And what Joseph Taylor, there are many things he did discuss, but mainly the From North Carolina as an Anti-Federalist paper is mostly structured around impeachment. And he has some very interesting questions that you don't really hear anywhere else. Or maybe you do. I haven't gone through every Anti-Federalist paper yet, but we have not heard this yet. Notably, he's talking about impeachment, and he says, well, the Constitution says the federal government has the sole power of impeachment. Does that mean that only the federal government could impeach state senators or a North Carolina state assembly person? Or can North Carolina impeach its own people? And the Federalist argument was, well, isn't that obvious? And Joseph Taylor was like, no, it's not obvious. It's not written down. What is written down is the word sole. Ow. You have sole power of impeachment. Why is that? And then he goes on to say, so there are going to be tax collectors for the federal government sprinkled out through all the colonies. Let's say one of these people are abusing their position. Does that mean that in order to have my complaints or this town's complaints or a city's complaints against one tax collector working for the federal government, do we have to go all the way to the Capitol, which at that time no one knew where the Capitol was going to be? Could have been in the tip of Maine for all they knew. It wouldn't have been, but it looked like it might have been New York City. So am I going to have to go from New York to Boston? I'm sorry, New York to New York, North Carolina, New York City, or Boston, or Philly, or wherever, just to get in touch with Congress, to have Congress redress my grievances and then send it to the Senate. Like, no regular person can do that. It's going to be rampant in violations of privacy from these tax collectors you're sending out, which is why we sent a war in the first place. Furthermore, how am I supposed to afford to get my witnesses before they have cars and airplanes all the way up to, assuming that the capital would be north of North Carolina? How are we supposed to do this? This is crazy talk. And it was a very persuasive argument, because it's one of the main reasons that at this convention, North Carolina said no thanks, no Constitution, please. And along with Rhode Island, was one of only 2 states that had not ratified the Constitution once George Washington had already taken his seat as president. There is one other thing that's not technically part of the From North Carolina article, but in all this research I did and didn't find much about Taylor, I did find another thing he said during the ratification convention at Hillsborough, which I found fascinating. He was curious as to why the delegates in the at the Constitutional Convention, why they felt the need to write the words "We the People" at the beginning of the Constitution. Now, living today, well, gee whiz, "We the People" is the heart of what it is to be an American. I guess the Declaration of Independence really is, but "We the People" is super common. Everyone agrees that, not Joseph Taylor. His attitude was, no. The North Carolina delegates were sent as representatives of the state. All of these delegates were sent by their states as representatives of the states. Sure, the people elected the state governments, but no one elected the delegates. The state governments literally just chose who they thought might do a good job. So they in no way represented the people. Anywho, and I just thought that was absolutely fascinating that he had that critique. And I will note that, like, Governor Morris, who wrote the preamble to the Constitution, "We the People," very purposely chose "We the People" to make it more appealing at the ratification conventions, saying, look, we're a republic, when, like, many of the anti-federalists were saying, similar to what Taylor was saying, is like, what do you mean the people? Like, this isn't a democracy. What are you, crazy? Like, no. We don't want the people voting. What are you thinking? So that is Joseph Taylor and From North Carolina. Now, I'm going to take a quick sip of my drink here while I pop up the next scheme. And it is Peter Jefferson, who you might recognize as the dad of Thomas Jefferson. More accurately, the article, again, on the weekends I republish old articles. If you can go to my website 5 days a week, but you need to subscribe to one of my social media accounts or my email account to get the regular weekend ones. Anywho, this is an old article I wrote, and it's really actually about the Fry-Jefferson map more than Peter Jefferson specifically, though I will talk about him a little bit. But technically there's an extra founder in this, because it's Fry and Jefferson. And Fry is Joshua Fry, who was an Oxford-educated man who ends up moving to Virginia and becomes a professor of mathematics at the College of William and Mary, which makes him one of the most important mathematicians in the pre-revolutionary United States. And again, this article is about something that happened in 1750, I believe, so pretty well before the actual revolution, but I think it sets a good stage, and it's informative. Let's go through it. Fry becomes an important leader. He's just a mathematician at William and Mary, but he becomes an important leader, becomes friendly with the royal governor, and eventually he ends up becoming commander-in-chief of the Virginia militia. And it's during this time that the royal governor instructs him to start doing certain surveys, but he's a mathematician, which means there's a lot of mathematics in surveying, but he wants to get someone local who knows the terrain, who also is good at surveying, and he found Peter Jefferson. Now, despite his son's achievements, Peter Jefferson had very little formal education. He, like many people we've discussed on this channel, made his name as a surveyor. He surveying was a great way for someone of a lower income to get a foot in the door to politics and to making a successful living. Peter Jefferson made a name as one of the best surveyors in the colonies. And again, this is at a time where George Washington is a surveyor in colonial United States. For comparison, Washington is younger than Jefferson, certainly. Peter Jefferson, certainly. But by 1750, he's 1819. Actually, let me backtrack on that, because now that I'm doing the math in my head, Washington was probably just coming of age and beginning a career as a surveyor, so they weren't really in competition. But Peter Jefferson goes on. He meets Joshua Fry, and Joshua Fry says, "Hey, Peter, would you like to help me do this survey?" And yeah, okay. And they go. First, they do a map of the northern neck of Virginia. And then they go help settle some border disputes with North Carolina. During which, these are very dangerous tasks, where not only were there Native Americans that might be hostile, but there were wild animals. In fact, I read that they would sleep in trees during their surveys so that the animals would not attack them. Though, I feel like bears and lions can climb trees, so I'm not sure. But it worked, and they survived. And they go on to be given the 1750 survey by the Royal Governor, who says, go out and map the entire colony of Virginia. And what comes of this is right here. It's known as the Fry-Jefferson map. And it was far and away the most accurate map of Virginia, not only up until that time, but for decades. Because it was such a big project for them to do. They had a whole team. Now, it's not the easiest to see here. It's mostly what's modern Virginia. At the time, again, Kentucky was considered part of Virginia, as were Pennsylvania. like Pittsburgh was Virginia thought it was theirs, part of the Ohio Territory. But, as you can see, well, maybe it's a little hard to see, but they cover a great expanse of modern day, almost the entirety of modern day Virginia, including all the mountains, many of the important roads. Again, it's hard to see here, but if you zoom in, there's extraordinary detail in this map. I suggest you Google it. And this comes into play because, well, when George Washington and the British are warring with each other, well, what map do you think both of them were using when they were going north to south across the colonies? Virginia is the biggest colony, the most powerful colony, the most populated colony, and right in the middle of the other colonies. So, this map, the Fry-Jefferson map, was extraordinarily important. Now, again, Peter Jefferson never really got to be that important in his life. Not nearly what his son became, of course, but based on his work as a surveyor, and up to and including the Fry-Jefferson map, he was able to make enough of a living, as I mentioned, that surveyors could, to move yourself up basically into the middle class, that he was able to afford his child an education, and that child, while I get something in my eye, would write the Declaration of Independence, and then, be president. So, we have this map of Virginia to thank. Sorry, I apologize, I'm wiping my eye, I got something in my face. We have this map of Virginia to thank from Peter Jefferson, the father of Thomas Jefferson, for, again, not just giving us a future president, but helping America win the war. Although, to be fair, the British had the map also, and so he could have just as easily been helping the British to win the war, but obviously that's not how it went down. But his map was literally in the hands of everyone making important strategic decisions on both sides of the war during the Revolutionary War. I do want to note, Joshua Fry died very quickly after this, after falling from a horse, and then Peter Jefferson himself also passed away while his son was still very young. And then he went on to be. Oh, and I do want to know, I'm seeing here. So, obviously, they made copies of the maps, they made copies of everything at the time. The original map was lost in the fire in 1770. We know Thomas Jefferson for living at Monticello, but he grew up at, and his father owned and had left to Thomas a property called Shadwell. And there's a famous fire that happened in 1770 in Shadwell, and of the many documents that I would love to get my hands on that we lost during the Shadwell fire. Included is the original Fry Jefferson map. Anyway, let's move on. Unless, of course, you have questions, though, as we've learned, there's more questions in trivia than there are for the Founders of the Week. And we are here at Christopher Ludwig. Now, speaking of trivia, for those of you who hung out for a while at the end of trivia, we actually spoke about Christopher Ludwig last Friday for a while, but it made me think, oh, you know what? It's Christmas time, and he's a fun guy to talk about this time of year. Because he was a big, jolly gingerbread baker. Not a gingerbread man. I almost said gingerbread man. Excuse me. Gotta get myself in. We're halfway through. Gotta make moves. So, Christopher Ludwig was a German immigrant who came over a while before the American Revolution began. He had already served in several armies throughout, because again, Germany at the time wasn't Germany as we think of it today. It was several separate German states, Prussia, Hesse, blah, blah, blah. And Ludwig had already served in several armies. But he moved to Philadelphia and he took up a profession he preferred more than soldiering, baking. He became very well known as a gingerbread baker. Now, he did bake a wide variety of items to sell to the public, because it might not have the smorgasbord of options that we have today back then, but, you know, they didn't just eat gingerbread. So he did bake a lot of different things, but he became known for his gingerbread. And the part of Philadelphia he lived in was always filled with the scent of gingerbread, thanks to Christopher Ludwig. Then the American Revolution breaks out, and Ludwig loves his new home, and he supports the Patriots in several ways. First of all, at this point, now I'm going to speculate here, perhaps due to all the gingerbread, Christopher had gained a lot of weight, and he was no longer in soldiering condition. So, great link in your story to the Dr. Rush book about Chris. Okay, I'll get back to that, man. Anyway, Christopher Ludwig gotten really big and could no longer serve as a soldier, but he wanted to help. So he actually secretly rows a boat across from New Jersey to Staten Island, where the British, they had brought, as many people would know, they had hired mercenaries from Germany, Hessian soldiers primarily, who were stationed on Staten Island. So Christopher Ludwig rows his big butt over to Staten Island, where he talks to the Germans who are there in German, and not speaking German, actually with the German accent, and they were receptive to that. And he attempted to negotiate with them and try and get them to switch sides. Now, it seems like he got a few of them to come over. It didn't work out as well as he planned, but he was basically saying, life is great here. After that, he went back to Pennsylvania, and many German soldiers that were being captured throughout the war were actually pushed further west in Pennsylvania, and that's where they were kept as prisoners of war. And during this time, Christopher Ludwig goes out to these people, many Germans, and he would not only go through their communities, because they were allowed to kind of live out there unsupervised. They weren't, this is getting off topic, but for a variety of reasons, the Germans basically kind of lived there because there were already German people living there. So Ludwig goes out there and takes them around. He brought some of them back to Philadelphia, was showing them around, and look at how great it is for Germans here. Pennsylvania is the best for Germans, and a lot of people did agree. He got many soldiers to agree to switch sides and fight for the Patriots. Now after this, by this point, Ludwig has come to the attention of both George Washington and the Continental Congress, and Congress appoints Ludwig to the position of Baker General of the Continental Army. Okay, I'm just going to throw this back out there. They appointed him to the position of Baker General of the Continental Army. He had technically the rank of general. Yesterday or the day before, I put out a video about Andrew Craigie, who was the Apothecary General. You think Apothecary General is silly? This guy was the Baker General of the Continental Army. And his job was to feed the troops. it's no little task. Of course, there were quartermasters and adjutant generals who had helped to fund the supplies and get the food to the soldiers. But as Baker General, he was responsible for overseeing the baking of all the breads and all the necessary foods to sustain these soldiers. And he had a whole team under him who, would take the grain and grind it up and get it into bread. Now, I do want to note that a lot of flour was given directly to soldiers who weren't necessarily in camp and things like that. In fact, you may have seen, if you are a Patreon and support me on my Patreon page, which if you want to do that now, you can still see the video I actually made. They were called ash cakes. They go by many names, but ash cakes, which essentially was you take some flour and you put some water on it and you put it in a fire. You put it on a rock next to the fire, take it off, and it's a little piece of bread cracker, which, as I mentioned, actually tastes a lot like pretzels. But, while I digress a little bit, I did want to note, it's not like he was feeding all the bread to all the soldiers. Many soldiers did take feeding themselves upon themselves. They got the food from the army, but did generally feed themselves. But when you were in camp, he was responsible for making sure each camp had a baker, and each baker was baking. And the most interesting baking he did was at the Battle of Yorktown. He was a general, and he went to the Battle of Yorktown. Again, he didn't really do any fighting. He wasn't expected to. But after the siege of Yorktown and the Americans won the victory at Yorktown, well, George Washington called for his baker general. And he said, we have this enemy under our control. They need to eat. We're not going to let them starve to death. They were just soldiers doing their job. I need you to bake me 6,000 pounds of bread by the morning. And that's a lot of bread. I've never had 6,000 pounds of bread before. And somehow Christopher Ludwig did it. He baked 6,000 pounds of bread in a field, or like in tents, in one night. And speaking of Washington, so Christopher Ludwig was often addressed by Washington as my dear friend. What was it? No, it wasn't. It was my honest friend. I apologize. My honest friend. He always addressed him as my honest friend. And it seems to be that Christopher Ludwig never accepted any payment for doing this job. And not just that, he didn't accept payment for the flour he was using to bake 6,000 pounds of bread, or more and more bread. Like he just paid for it. And this was a mistake, because after the war, after essentially 8 years of paying for bread for the Continental Army, well, Ludwig returned home and was broke. And while he did not like having handouts, he did not love having handouts. He eventually did realize he had to petition the Continental Congress for not payment of his services, but a veteran's pension. He needed a petition for a pension. He didn't like it, but he did. While he was petitioning for man, I just can't get the words out. Pension. While he was petitioning for this pension, he, as many people did, he had several people write in his behalf. And one of the people who wrote on Ludwig's behalf was George Washington. And not George Washington telling his secretary to do it like usually happened. George Washington himself wrote to the Continental Congress and said Christopher Ludwig was Baker General of the Continental Army. Give him some money. I'm just a family channel. I'm getting heated. Give him some money. He deserves it. So they did. Fortunately, they did. And Christopher Ludwig, for the rest of his life, had that letter George Washington wrote to the Continental Congress framed and up on his wall. So what did he do with this money? Christopher Ludwig rebuilt his business and, again, made a mini fortune. It wasn't like the wealthiest person in the world, but again, he'd made enough as a baker to pay for the army's baked goods for 8 years before going broke. And because he got this little bit of money, he was able to rebuild his business and with it, make his money back. Unfortunately, his wife he had a child die very young, and his wife had passed away early. So what he did is he took on the poor children of Philadelphia to be his children, and he donated to their causes. He helped pay for the education of arguably, perhaps hundreds of children throughout Philadelphia. And in fact, because of this, an organization, when he died, he left a considerable sum of money to the city of Philadelphia as a trust to benefit the children and charities in Philadelphia. And it was named in his honor. And the Christopher Ludwig Foundation is still around helping poor children get educations in Philadelphia today. That is Christopher Ludwig. The last thing I will note is there's actually a book about him called Gingerbread for Liberty. Now, it is a children's book, but it is, I think, it's the only biography I know about him. And what's very interesting is it's kind of like a picture book. I would estimate, and I don't know how old it's for, but I would estimate it's for children somewhere between the ages of like 8 and 12. It's not an easy read, and it's a little thicker. Like, I'm not going to sit there with my 4-year-old. He's not going to have the patience to get through the whole book. I mean, that probably says more about me as a parent than anything else. But it's too thick to really get through one reading with a small child. But it's good for a child of middle age. And at the end, it actually has a sourced biography. It's only, I think, a page, if I remember. But he has a biography. Like, it's a fun kid's book, and then at the end there's like a grown-up biography. So, like, I recommend it. Get it for kids for Christmas, especially because it has the word gingerbread, which helps. So that is the unbearably underappreciated life of Christopher Ludwig. We are going to go on and finish up today with a few super random people. I did realize most of the people I wrote about this week are extremely random. Take a quick sip of this. I see some comments coming in. Went through Hamilton. Linked my story to Rushbook about Chris. Don't know what you're saying there, Matt. One eye. Oh, did he have one eye? I'm surprised I didn't come across that. Although, again, this is an article I wrote a year ago that the research I did for this video was reread my old article because it's pretty lengthy. It's much longer than most of the articles I write. I don't recall him having one eye, although I wouldn't put it past him. It was back then. I don't know what that means. Threw some rocks in the bread so they weighed more. Well, I guess that's not very nice, Ashley. Come on. Hope he didn't bake the bread before the Battle of Camden. The only real... Oh, yeah, duh. Okay. I'm an idiot. I know what you're saying. You're actually talking about the actual article where I wrote... You can find... That's right. Most of the research I had done was not from the kids' book. That's right. I apologize. Thank you, Matt. Thank you for reminding me, because I did write this article about a year ago, and now that you're saying it, it has jostled my memory. There is a free... Dr. Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration of Independence and father of American psychiatry, was friends with this man and wrote kind of a mini biography about him. Oh, excuse me. Okay. Well, great. Thank you, Matt. Always on top of things. And at the end, I do want to know, at the end I am going to talk about an idea I have for the book club that we started. For those of you new here, I did try and start a book club on Patreon. Well, I'm going to get to that. I'm going to allude to it. I also have a video coming out over there within the next day or two explaining the changes. Why I can't seem to read a whole book in one month. It's because I'm always writing these articles. This is essentially what's going on. All right, let's get on to Blair, a person whose last name I can't even get right in my head, and it's not even that challenging. Blair McClenachan. Blair McClenachan. I don't know why. Every time I see it, it's a different one. Oh, you saw me, TJ? Did you see my shout out? I give you a shout out. I knew you were over there. TJ's alluding to, I went on my friend Jay Burmis's show the other day. It's a conspiracy show, be warned. But I did a little interview on the militia back then and how it relates to today. And I believe TJ, with probably a few of you, found me over on Jay Burmis. Don't take what he discusses over there as a reflection on my beliefs. I have many very, not personal, but he's a great friend of mine, but many disagreements with what he's saying over there. Excuse me. So let's talk about Blair McClellan. He was born over in Ireland and then came to America as a child. And he started working as a merchant. And then the American Revolution breaks out. And he wants to side with the Patriots. Now, he had made a fortune as a merchant in Philadelphia, and I will tell you, he certainly didn't want to serve in the war, but he was happy to pay for it. Now, when you think of Philadelphia merchants who funded the American Revolution, for those of you nerdy like I am, your first thought is generally financier of the American Revolution, Robert Morris. However, he was far from the only person financing the revolution, and in fact, Blair McClellan was, when they were raising money to finance the Continental Army, Blair McClellan was the second highest donor of his own personal fortune to the American Revolution, both to the outfitting of the Continental Army and to the support of the Continental, which is the currency that didn't work out very well. But Blair McClellan put a ton of money in. He helped buy certain products from overseas covertly. Oh, change the picture. Thanks, Matt. Whammy. Nailed it. What a guy. What a guy. Thank you, Matt. This guy, Blair McClellan. Blair McClenachan, not Blair McClanahan? Anyway, Blairy boy over here put in the second most amount of money into funding the American Revolution. Of course, he's overshadowed by Robert Morris, but he purchased products from overseas to come over. He was a merchant who owned a bunch of ships, and he outfit his own ships to go fight in the war. And yada, yada, yada. Paid for the American Revolution. Then years go by after the war. He's still being rich and wealthy, and then the Constitution's written. And after the Constitution was written, while most wealthy merchants became Federalists, Blair McClellan actually sided with the Democratic Republican Party, and he became a chairman of Philadelphia's Democratic Society. And the Democratic Societies were kind of like local political parties that started popping up here and there around the colonies to support the, well, Democratic Republican Party. What do you know? And George Washington eventually publicly, in an address to Congress, criticizes these societies. And Blair McClellan actually published an article, which he's not known for his writing. It's not something he usually did, but he published an article kind of critiquing Washington, not like saying things like James Monroe, as we talked about last week, but like being like, "Oh shucks, George, you sure?" It's funny. There wasn't much of a backlash to this, except John Adams, in a letter to one of his kids, I think it was Charles, he actually calls him King McClellan and viewed his paper as a manifesto against the president. Though, at the same time, he does refer to, I hope my friend, in another letter he referred to, I hope my friend from 75 goes back to who he was, more or less. like admitting, like, yeah, Blair McClellan paid for this war that John Adams kind of helped start, but I hope he comes back to his senses. Again, he called him King McClellan, which is like playful, kind of in a John Adams-y sense. Now, unfortunately for Blair McClellan, just like Robert Morris and many other wealthy founders, especially merchants from Philadelphia, after the war, he tried to take advantage and invest in land, and he bought a whole lot of land and then couldn't sell it, and then the land bubble collapsed. And what do you know? Blair McClellan goes bankrupt, and, much like Robert Morris, actually goes to debtor's prison. Now, also like Robert Morris, we like to think that he went to debtor's prison because he paid for the war out of his pocket and spent all his money on the revolution. That's not entirely true. While they did lose a lot of money, it wasn't nearly 100% of it. Probably wasn't even 50% of it. They lost that on land speculation. So before I had this channel, people who I spoke to 15 years ago about this Sorry for misinforming you, but those are, just so you know, also people who don't care. That's why I started this channel, because I wanted to talk to people who actually care about the American Revolution and are not like, okay, Jay, okay, I'm gonna go make dinner. Come on, Mom, this is cool. I shouldn't say that. My mom actually does think it's cool. My dad thinks what I'm doing is cool, but come on, Dad, like, you don't love the revolution. Like, he's a chemistry nerd. And that's that. So Blair, who I keep calling Blair McLennan, I don't know why. Blair McClenachin? He was only in debtor's prison for a brief time, then comes out and is able to make enough money to successfully retire. That is the story of Blair McClenachin, I guess. And we're going to move on to Timothy Pierce. And yes, that's how you spell it. I very specifically had to triple check on this. Just McClenachin? I don't know, Tarot. Dude, I'm trying. I'm past it. I've already brought the next person up on screen. Thank you for trying to help me, but I'm beyond help with this particular name. So, Timothy Pierce. This is another fun story about a person who, like, not a lot of information out there. Another person I spent, like, way too much time on. Usually if I spend, like, an hour or 2 or 3 hours... This one was broken up. Usually if I spend 2 hours researching a person in one day, I, like, have to write that article. As I've told you before, I'm publishing 5 days a week, so I just have to take what I got on this person and write it. Now, with Timothy Pierce is interesting. I found this story actually researching Blair McClenachin. He's back to haunt me. I was researching him when I came across the story and said, this has got to be its own article. And then after I wrote the Blair one, I was looking through over the weekend. I'm like, I can't find anything about this guy's life. So, here's what I know. The story itself is cool. What I know about Timothy Pierce is he was from Rhode Island. It looks like he was from Providence, Rhode Island. Again, Providence. I'm having trouble with the same words today as always. It looks like he was from the same Pierce family that had been around for about 100 years and even had ancestors that had served in King Philip's War with the Native Americans back in the 1600s. When the war broke out, Timothy Pierce became a captain of a sloop called the Gamecock. Seen it spelled as one word and 2 words. And I want to note, I made up a term that I've never seen anywhere, but I made it up. I called it the Gamecock Affair. Could have called it the Hancock and Adams Affair, but that's a little bit confusing. Just realizing they're both the names of ships, and apparently they both have dirty words snuck in there. Blair McClenachin, who we were just discussing, as I mentioned, he outfitted several of his own ships to serve in the Revolutionary War. In the Navy, the Revolutionary Navy, the Continental Navy, whatever you want to call it. And one of his ships was named the Hancock and Adams. That's the name of the ship. 3 words, 1 name. Hancock and Adams. It's the name of the ship. I know it makes it more confusing than it has to be. Thinking that the whole time. So, Blair over here, he rents out his ship. He fits it as a privateer, and he rents it out to the Secret Committee. Now, the Secret Committee was made by the Continental Congress to negotiate in secret with foreign countries, as famously run by Benjamin Franklin for a time, with many other important founders on board, and they were the ones who sent Silas Deane over to negotiate with the French before independence, and before they could do it publicly without making Britain very mad at France. And Spain and the Netherlands, but France was the big go-to country. So one of the things the Secret Committee does is they're trying to have Silas Deane over there buying goods to secretly send back, so they need a ship. So they commission the Hancock and Adams and send it over to Spain, actually, where it picks up its first cargo. And then it turns around and comes back to North America to bring these It was mostly like supplies for soldiers. It wasn't. I don't. It wasn't so much gunpowder, but not uniforms. Thank you. I found it. Uniforms and blankets and all sorts of things that an army would need to operate appropriately are packed on the ship, and it heads back. And before it gets to the United States, not far from the United States or soon to be United States, well, what do you know? It's met by another ship, and this ship is called the Gamecock. And the Gamecock, as I said, was a sloop being captained by Timothy Pierce. Now, the way I saw the story was from the point of view of the secret committee, who were real upset that they had paid for this ship, though, to be fair, they got the money from Blair McLaughlin and then rented the ship with his money from him. I'm just realizing that connection right now. But they were real unhappy that the ship they rented went across and was bringing supplies to the army, and here it is getting stopped by an American patriot? What are you doing? Then they accused, and what happens is, I should finish the story. From their point of view, Timothy Pierce stops an American ship and no one would suspect a ship named Hancock and Adams. I know, that's another great point. I didn't even think of that, Matt. That is an amazing point. Like, the ship's name is Hancock and Adams. That's actually a very good point, and I will get to why. Now that I've laughed at it, that's a really great point, because this gentleman, the Gamecock, stops a ship, and Timothy Pierce says, "Where are you going? What are you doing?" And they say, "We're Americans. We're bringing these supplies to the American army." And Timothy Pierce says, "I don't believe you," and brings the ship to Massachusetts. I forget exactly which town. Bedford, Massachusetts. And it sits there while he figures out what to do with it. Now, this ship, what I did find out about this ship, it was actually owned by several other people. They just chose him as captain. Because, again, it was a privateer ship, so it was a merchant ship that was outfitted for war to plunder and bring back. And that's exactly what the secret committee said of Timothy Pierce. They said, hey, is, quote, love of plunder. The love of plunder is why Pierce did this. Because they wanted to make money. And they ordered that all the products on that ship be sent directly to George Washington. Now, again, from their point of view, it seems like they were just trying to profit off this war. Because, privateers, I'll remind you, are just basically pirates that are given a letter of marque from the government saying you can be a pirate in our name. But when it came to, stealing our own supplies, that's not cool. So they were not happy about that. But, and I do appreciate what you're saying about the ship's name, Hancock and Adams. But I want to know, I don't know a lot about ships at the time, but I don't believe, like today, the name was written on the side of the ship. I think the name of the ship would have been on the ship's papers, the document papers. And I think there was a word for it that I'm not remembering. Either way, this ship was sent by the secret committee in secret. And the reason Pierce took the ship hostage is because he went on board and said, "Can I see your papers so I can know who you're sailing for?" And apparently, on board the Hancock and Adams, there were 3 sets of papers. Now, this was done by the secret committee to throw any Brits who might have taken the ship off the scent of whose ship it was. Granted, I don't know how giving them 3 sets of papers would have worked against the British when it didn't work against Americans. My only assumption is that when it was a patriot who took the ship, and again, this is an assumption, first of all, I think the names of the ships would have been on these papers and not spewed across the ship. I think, Matthew. I'm not 100% sure of that. Again, I don't know a ton about naval, like the inner operations of a naval ship during this time. But like I said, I do know that he had 3 sets of papers. And it seems to me that what happened is when the Hancock and Adams was captured, they said, "You're an American? Okay, great. We work for the secret committee. Here are our 3 sets of papers," because the Hancock and Adams was trying to be honest with the Gamecock and be like, we're on the same team. And the Gamecock said, I just captured this ship, and they have 3 sets of papers. Like, I mean, they might be pirates. They might legitimately be pirates. I don't know. Granted, pirates probably wouldn't have just let you walk on board. So, Hancock and Adams is brought to port in New Bedford. Now, unfortunately, from there, again, like I said, the Secret Committee and the Continental Congress ordered that all be transferred to George Washington as quickly as possible. And while he was a little peeved that it took so long to get there, he did get the supplies for the army, and essentially no harm, no foul. Now, as for Pierce, again, I couldn't find a lot about his life, so I don't know really what happened to him after this. He doesn't seem to have been tried, because if anyone was to go on trial, it would be, much like we discussed with Joseph Fenwick, what was it, 2 weeks ago, it would be the owner of the ship that got in trouble, not the captain. And since he was not technically working, it was, he wasn't, I'm sorry, I can't get it out. He wasn't technically working for like a militia or the Continental Navy or the Continental Army, so he couldn't be court-martialed. He was a private citizen who was given this permission. And I got distracted because thank you, Tarot, for telling everyone to like and subscribe. I'm not good at being being a YouTuber, apparently. Thank you for the reminder, Tarot. I do appreciate that. So that's the story of the Gamecock. Again, Timothy Pierce, a nobody, a rando. I can't even figure out who he is. But I thought this story was amazing and had to write an article about it. Because truthfully, this was an easy article to write. Because, I mean, what a story. I read the story once and was like, great, I got it. And now, again, as I said earlier, I talked a lot. We're going to go to the last founder of the day here. As I talked about earlier, there were several super random people this week. And next we're going to James Witherspoon, and I'm going to take a sip of this while you think about that. Because when you hear the name Witherspoon, obviously you think about Reese Witherspoon. And I am going to finish this video with a guess about the life of Reese Witherspoon. So, don't turn away though, because first we're talking about James Witherspoon. And who you really think of if you think about the American Revolution and the name Witherspoon, you may think of the name John Witherspoon, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a preacher, and the only preacher to sign the Declaration of Independence, and president of Princeton University. James Witherspoon is his son. And again, despite his father's popularity, like his father was a humongously important American founder. He's on my list of top 100, which I know doesn't say a lot, but like, come on. There were a lot of founders. And literally, if you're new here, go to my website. I put out a top 10 fantasy founders list every year, so I literally have, actually at this point, 3 lists that are different somehow. It grows with what I learn. But James Witherspoon, there's not a whole lot of information about his life. So here's what I could tell you. James Witherspoon was born in Ireland. No. Scotland. Whoopsie doozy. Let's start over. Can't tell you anything, apparently. James Witherspoon was born in Scotland. And as a young teenager, about the age of 13, he starts studying at the University of Glasgow. Now, his father, John Witherspoon, was actually recruited by Dr. Benjamin Rush, who we mentioned before, and Richard Stockton. They were both happened to be in Scotland at the same time. I believe at Edinburgh. I don't know how to pronounce it. Edinburgh? Where they confronted John Witherspoon and convinced him to move to New Jersey and take up the job as president of Princeton, what was then known as the College of New Jersey. So, he does this. Therefore, his son John, who is now about 19, emigrates with the rest of his family to the United States. Now, he's still a young man at this point, just in his, not even 20, about 19 years old when James Witherspoon first comes to America, and he moves to New Jersey with his family. And what do you know? He studies at the school his father's in charge of, Princeton, and he gets 2 degrees by 1773. And then, he doesn't really have the opportunity to get off on his own career because the American Revolutionary War breaks out. And he wants to go fight and make something of himself, as many young men did. So he goes out and he ends up first working with William Maxwell as an aide-de-camp to William Maxwell. And then he changes it and becomes an aide-de-camp to Francis Nash. And he is working as an aide-de-camp as the rank of major for Brigadier General Francis Nash when they get to the Battle of Germantown. Now, the Battle of Germantown is a long, interesting thing, which I should give a shout out. I actually was turned on to this story listening to the American Revolution podcast. You may remember I had Michael Troy on for an interview over the summer. American Revolution podcast is an amazing way to learn about the American Revolution, and his Battle of Germantown is extremely interesting because there's 4 different armies of the Continental Army attacking the British troops stationed at Germantown. And he does a great job of talking about each one, some more than others. I mean, one of them, the name escapes me, the Brigadier General who's leading them around one side didn't even make it in time, but that's another point. The point is, at one point, the Americans are retreating, and Francis Nash, along with John Witherspoon, his aide-de-camp, James Witherspoon, his aide-de-camp, they're covering the retreat. And unfortunately, there's a ball, and the only word I could figure out was ball, and I don't know if it was a bullet or if it was a cannon. So I used in the article the word ball. I have the feeling it's a cannonball, because Nash is on his horse, and James Witherspoon is right behind him, and the ball goes through Nash's thigh and strikes James Witherspoon right in the face. I think it was a cannonball because the term used most frequently that I saw when it hit him in the face was exploded. And I don't think they meant the cannonball. Of course, this young man, who was only 26 years old at the time and had all the potential in the world, was supposed to be just as intelligent as his father, if not more, should have gone on to be a extraordinarily important founder. Doesn't, because he obviously dies instantly when, like I said, his head exploded. And as for Francis Nash, who Witherspoon was acting as an aide-de-camp for and was just behind, Nash, his leg was blown to bits. He survived for 4 more days, but then he also passes away. And I believe it's Francis Nash who the city of Nashville is named after. Although, I'm just playing by memory, that might have been his brother, not Alistair, Abner Nash. I think it was Francis Nash that Nashville's named after. If it's not him, it is his brother, Abner Nash. I wrote about them both like a year and a half ago, and I know for a fact it's one of the two. Okay, so here's my Reese Witherspoon story, and I know this sounds super crazy. I'm researching the name Witherspoon in the past week, and the name Nash, trying to find out more about these guys. And so Reese Witherspoon, although apparently this has not been confirmed by anyone, she claims lineage to John Witherspoon, the Witherspoon family. Makes sense. Doesn't seem like there's a lot of Witherspoons out there moving to the United States. Maybe I'm wrong. And I don't know anything about her family. I really don't. I mean, I will say I popped on Wikipedia real quick because I was following the story, and viewers are just leaving at this point. Okay, I'll make it quick. So, apparently Reese Witherspoon had a dog named Nash. And interestingly, I told it in the wrong order. John Witherspoon has a brother, whose name escapes me, who married the widow of Francis Nash's brother, Abner Nash. And they had Witherspoon children, and the name Nash carried with their family's name. And it does seem that Reese Witherspoon has an ancestor with the middle name Nash, and then she had a dog that, unfortunately, I found an article about how about a year and a half ago, Reese Witherspoon's dog passed away, and I felt bad, but it says, Reese Witherspoon's dog, Nash. And I have this sinking suspicion that thank you, TJ, that's very nice of you to say, I have not done enough research to what I'm about to tell you to be true. I just have a suspicion that her dog that passed away recently, I would suspect that you could trace her dog's name back through her family name to the Nashes and Witherspoons coming together in such a nature. Again, Maybe she just liked the name. No idea. But that has been plaguing my mind the last few days. Just wanted to bring you guys in. Feel free to figure that out for me. If you guys can confirm that for me, I would be forever in your debt. And I am forever in your debt because you guys, take an hour of your life on a Wednesday night to hang out with me, and I really appreciate that. I'm glad you guys like the American Revolution like I do. As Tara pointed out, please hit like on your way out. Any questions, I'm always available. I have my links below to all my social medias as well as my email address. Feel free to reach out to me. If you'd like to support the channel, check out my Patreon page. For those of you who are Patriots, thank you so much. You know who you are. I know at the very least TJ and Matt are here. I wouldn't be surprised if Lauren, I'm sorry, not Lauren. Well, I wouldn't be surprised if Lauren popped in later, but Troy, wouldn't be surprised if you maybe watch later if you're not here right now. Thank you all so much. I've been figuring out how to really use Patreon best for you guys. So, I think I figured out a few ways we can learn together over there, and I'm going to put out a video. I think I'm going to try and make it tomorrow, probably put out Friday, explaining some of my ideas, some of the upgrades. But for those of you who are already supporting the channel, again, like all the money you've been generous with has gone to like new cameras, new microphone, like new programs that I'm experimenting with here, and I've had to throw some out because I've screwed some of it up. Nah, I haven't wasted that much money this year. But it has been wasted in the past. So thank you guys so much. Again, any questions, feel free. I usually try and keep to an hour, but we're 8 minutes over right now, and I don't want to take up everyone's whole life. I did waste 2 minutes of your time at the beginning where apparently I muted myself because, like, I'm not very good at being on the internet. I probably look at myself over here instead of the camera way more than I should. I probably should be looking over here at, like, my notes more than myself. But, I mean, like, I got this sweet new shirt that I, like, found my wife trying to covertly purchase. We went to do Santa Claus today at the Bass Pro Shop, which I don't know if you guys live by a Bass Pro Shop or if you do Santa Claus or not, or how it would be by you, but not sponsored. But we've gone every year since my kid was born, and they do a fantastic job over there. And then we walk around and look at stuff, and my kid wanted to look at something over there, so I was like, okay, let's go look at the toys. And my Emily was like, all right, I'll just go buy these few knickknacks we had. And I find one on my son. He had a name tag with his name on it. I was like, oh, Em, you got to buy this. And I ran over, and I was like, oh, you buying that shirt? She's like, yeah. Merry Christmas. And I was like, great. I wanted new flannels. You might have noticed I wear a lot of flannel to spice up the streams. So she's like, do you want to just wear it tonight? I'm like, yeah. So let me know what you like. Let me know. I don't love it with this hat. I need new hats. That's what's coming next. New hats. So lots of irrelevant stories to close out the night between Reese Witherspoon and me looking at my own shirt in the camera. I wasted a few extra minutes of your time, but thank you so much for those of you who did come and are still watching and did watch and will watch and everything. I'm going to pull up my dark screen now. 5 of you left. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much. I am going to leave the stream now and give you a round bottom. Yeah, I'm sponsored by Santa Claus. Imagine that, TJ. Hi, welcome to Founder of the Day, sponsored by Santa Claus. Okay, man. Yeah, you are. If anyone hasn't, on your way out, if you want to hit like, that is the most amazing thing in the world. And other than that, let me know what you think of my shirt. And round bottom.